President John F. Kennedy gave what I would describe as the scariest speech that I've ever heard. In October of 1962, the world almost came to an end. It's not fiction, it's not speculation, it almost happened. In fact, in terms of probability, it should have happened. The 13th day standoff between the United States and what was then the Soviet Union was a result after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion by the United States in Cuba in 1961. This invasion on the southwestern tip of Cuba was a failed attempt to overthrow the communist government of Fidel Castro. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev agreed to place nuclear missiles in Cuba to deter any future invasion. Construction of several missile sites began in late summer. U.S. intelligence discovered evidence of a general Soviet arms buildup on Cuba during routine reconnaissance surveillance flights. On September 4, 1962, President Kennedy issued a public warning against the introduction of offensive weapons in Cuba. Despite this warning, on October 14th, a U-2 high-altitude aircraft took several pictures clearly showing size from medium-range to intermediate-range ballistic missiles under construction in Cuba. These images were processed, interpreted, and presented to the White House the next day, thus precipitating the onset of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy summoned his closest advisors to consider options and direct course of action for the United States that would resolve the crisis. Some advisors, including all Joint Chiefs of Staff, argued for an airstrike to destroy the missiles, followed up by a U.S. invasion of ground forces in Cuba. The president decided upon a middle course. On October 22nd, he ordered a naval quarantine of Cuba. The use of the quarantine legally distinguished this action from a blockade, which of course is an act of war. The use of quarantine instead of a blockade also enabled the United States to receive support for the Organization of American States. That same day, Kennedy sent a letter to Khrushchev declaring that the United States would not permit offensive weapons to be delivered to Cuba. The president demanded that the Soviets dismantle the missile bases already under construction or completed and return all offensive weapons to USSR. The letter was the first in a series of direct and indirect communications between the White House and the Kremlin throughout the remainder of the crisis. October 22, 1962, the president also went on national television that evening to inform the public of the developments in Cuba. Kennedy explained his decision to initiate and enforce a quarantine and the potential global consequences if the crisis continued to escalate. The tone of the president's remarks was stern and the message was unmistakable and evocative of the Monroe Doctrine.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Upon receiving the first preliminary hard information of this nature, last Tuesday morning at 9 a.m., I directed that our surveillance be stepped up. And having now confirmed and completed our evaluation of the evidence and our decision on a course of action, this government feels obliged to report this new crisis to you in fullest detail. The characteristic of these new missile sites indicate two distinct types of installations. Several of them include medium-range ballistic missiles capable of carrying a nuclear warhead for a distance of more than 1,000 nautical miles. Each of these missiles, in short, is capable of striking Washington, D.C., the Panama Canal, Cape Canaveral, Mexico City, or any other city in the southeastern part of the United States, in Central America, or in the Caribbean area. Additional sites not yet completed appear to be designed for intermediate-range ballistic missiles, capable of traveling more than twice as far, and thus capable of striking most of the major cities in the Western Hemisphere, ranging as far north as Hudson's Bay, Canada, and as far south as Lima, Peru. In addition, jet bombers capable of carrying nuclear weapons are now being uncrated and assembled in Cuba, while the necessary air bases are being prepared. And in defiance of American and hemispheric policy, this sudden, clandestine decision to station strategic weapons for the first time outside of Soviet soil is a deliberately provocative and unjustified change in the status quo, which cannot be accepted by this country if our courage and our commitments are ever to be trusted again by either friend or foe. But the greatest danger of all would be to do nothing. The path we have chosen for the present is full of hazards, as all paths are. But it is the one most consistent with our character and courage as a nation and our commitments around the world. The cost of freedom is always high, but Americans have always paid it. And one path we shall never choose, and that is the path of surrender or submission. Our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right. Not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom here in this hemisphere, and we hope around the world. God willing, that goal will be achieved. Thank you and good night.
Now, the Joint Chiefs of Staff announced a military readiness status of DEFCON 3 as U.S. naval forces began implementation of the quarantine and the plans accelerated for a military strike on Cuba. On October 24th, Khrushchev responded to Kennedy's message stating that the U.S. blockade was an act of aggression and that the Soviet ships bound for Cuba would be ordered to proceed. Nevertheless, during October 24th and 25th, some ships turned back from the quarantine line. Others were stopped by U.S. naval forces, but they contained no offensive weapons and so were allowed to proceed. Meanwhile, U.S. reconnaissance flights over Cuba indicated the Soviet missile sites were nearing operational readiness. With no apparent end in the crisis in sight, U.S. forces were placed on DEFCON 2, meaning war involving the Strategic Air Command was imminent. On October 26, Kennedy told his advisors that he believed that only a U.S. attack on Cuba would remove the missiles, but he insisted on letting diplomatic channels have a little bit more time. That afternoon, however, the crisis took a dramatic turn. ABC News correspondent John Scali reported to the White House that he had been approached by a Soviet agent suggesting an agreement could be reached in which the Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba if the United States would promise not to ever invade the island. While White House staff scrambled to assess the validity of the back-channel offer, Khrushchev sent Kennedy a message in the evening of October 26, which meant it was sent in the middle of the night Moscow time. It was a long and emotional message that raised the specter of a nuclear holocaust and presented a proposed resolution that remarkably resembled what Scali reported earlier that day. If there is no intention, he said, to doom the world to a catastrophe of thermonuclear war, then let us not only relax the forces pulling on the ends of the rope, let us take measures to unite and untie the knot. We are ready for this. Although U.S. experts were convinced the message from Khrushchev was authentic, hope for a resolution was short-lived. The next day, October 27th, Khrushchev sent another message indicating that any proposed deal must include the removal of U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey. That same day, an Air Force U-2 reconnaissance jet was shot down over Cuba. Kennedy and his advisors prepared for an attack on Cuba within days as they searched for any remaining diplomatic solution. It was determined that Kennedy would ignore the second Khrushchev message and respond to the first. That night, Kennedy set forth in his message to the Soviet leader, proposing steps for the removal of Soviet missiles from Cuba under the supervision of the United Nations and a guarantee that the United States would not ever attack Cuba. This was a risky move to ignore the second message from Khrushchev. Attorney General Robert Kennedy then met secretly with Soviet Ambassador to the United States, Antonio Dobrynin, and indicated that the United States was planning to remove Jupiter missiles from Turkey anyway, and it would do so soon, but it could not be a part of any public resolution to this crisis. The next morning, October 28th, Khrushchev issued a public statement that the Soviet missiles would be dismantled and removed from Cuba. The crisis was over, but the naval quarantine continued until the Soviets agreed to remove their Il-28 bombers from Cuba. On November 20th, 1962, the United States ended its quarantine. The Jupiter missiles were removed from Turkey in April of 1963. Two other important results of the crisis came in unique forms. First, despite the flurry of direct and indirect communications between the White House and the Kremlin, and perhaps because of it, Kennedy and Khrushchev and their advisors struggled throughout the crisis to clearly understand each other's true intentions. After all, the world hung on the brink of possible nuclear war. So in an effort to prevent this from ever happening again, a direct telephone link between the White House and the Kremlin was established, and it became known as a hotline. Submarines. Perhaps the most dangerous moment of the Cuban Missile Crisis came on October 27th, when U.S. naval warships enforcing the blockade attempted to surface the Soviet B-59 submarine. It was one of 4 Foxtrot-class diesel electronic submarines sent from the Soviet Union to Cuba, all of which were detected and 3 of which were eventually forced to surface and return back to Moscow. But unbeknownst to the Americans, there was one B-59 that was equipped with a T-5 nuclear-tipped torpedo. It was capable of a blast equivalent to 10 kilotons of TNT, or roughly 2/3 of the strength of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. American warships tracking the submarine dropped depth charges on either side of the B-59 as a warning. The crew, unaware of the blockade, thought they were under attack. When communication with Moscow has not been established, it takes 3 senior officers to agree on a course of action. The captain shouted, "We're going to blast them. We'll all die, but we'll sink them all. We will not disgrace our Navy." However, the intel officer, Captain Vasily Alexandrov Arkhipov, dissented. He stated, "They did not know for sure that the ship was under attack," he argued. "Why not surface and wait for orders from Moscow?" So in the end, Vasily's view prevailed, and the B-59 surfaced near the American warships and was sent back home without any further incident. One final intel update. The Soviet Union had 43,000 troops in Cuba during the 62 missile crisis, not the 10,000 as reported by the CIA. In addition to the 43 Soviet troops, there were 270,000 trained Cuban troops. Now you may be wondering, why am I telling this story now? To remind people that there's good in this world, there's also evil. And many times the world has come and fought in 2 great wars. We cannot survive a third. We must remember who we are, what we stand for. If we lose that focus, if we lose our moral compass, then we'll become just like the enemy that we fought so many years ago. We need to continue to lead by example. We need to get our act together. We need to decide what kind of Americans we are. There is a sound of many voices, and it's a sound of revelry and of discontent and of laziness. If we can't end that, then we will soon come to an end. The choice is ours. Other countries are not so fortunate.